Okay, so good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I know there are people from across the world is joining us today. So I'm here. My name is Sujya Somanath, and I'm the principal investigator of COVISION study, which is funded by Health Research Board Ireland, Irish Research Council. So this month, the March, we have our special guest from Liverpool University, in both Edgell University and Liverpool Moore University, joining us today for the webinar on their study funded by NIHR. So before I officially introduce the team, I would like to highlight something today, very important. As a COVISION team led by Dublin, Ireland, we are officially launching our global call for children and young people to submit their artwork. So all information are updated through our website. It's www.covision.ie. But I just wanted to share you a little video. It's only take 1 minute. Is that okay? And then we will be officially starting our webinar. So let me share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Okay.
The year is 2020. COVID strikes. What did the kids do? Some were frightened. Some were strong. They all tried to be brave. Most had support from their families. Some didn't. All had thoughts, ideas, and feelings. Some used their creative skills like art, dance, video, anything that helped them through COVID. Some shared their experiences, feelings, and their messages. Are you one of them? COVISION is a global research project coordinated in Dublin, Ireland. Friends and partners all around the world. We want to see your creative artwork, the art that you made about your COVID experience. There's so much we can learn from looking at children's creative responses to COVID. Be a part of COVISION. Send us your artwork. We've got an online app to make it safe and easy for you. Send us stuff. Interested?
Thank you very much. So that's officially launched. So we will be sharing information to across the globe through our partners. So I really wanted to thank our global partners and our Children Research Advisory Group to support this designing and development of this promotional video and the flyers. So thank you, everybody. So I'm officially going to start our webinar. Thank you, Lucy, to offering us time as well to do this. So today I have the team. They are representing they are representing the project Ask, Listen, Act, which is funded by NIHR. This is very much looking at the children with a special education need and the disabilities. Parents, carers, and professionals to co-develop priorities for recovery and renewal after the pandemic. So it is my pleasure to welcome the team of the Ask, Listen, Act study. So I'm going to invite Dr. Emma Ashworth. Emma is a chartered psychologist and lecturer at the Liverpool John Moore University. Emma's work is focused on children, adolescent mental health, particularly risk and resilience and prevention and promotion strategies. I'm going to hand over to you, Emma, and I hope you don't mind introducing your team and the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us today. So yeah, as Suja was saying, my name's Emma. I'm the principal investigator on the Ask, Listen, Act project. I've also got two of my colleagues here with me today, Professor Lucy Bray from Edgell University and Dr. Joanna Kirkby from Liverpool John Moores University. So Lucy has expertise in children's rights and creative methodologies, and Joanna is our research assistant on the project. We also have Amel Algorani from University of Liverpool, who is caught up in teaching, so can't be here today, but she is also a key member of the team. So I'll hand over to Lucy, I think, to start.
Okay, thank you, Emma. So rather than putting the thank yous at the end of the presentation, we really wanted to put our thank yous front and central at the beginning, really, just to thank all the children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, their parents and carers, and all the professionals that took time during what was quite a challenging time for many to share their views and experiences and time with us. Without those people, this project would not have happened. We obviously would like to say thank you to the National Institute for Health Research for funding the study, We had an amazing steering committee of multiple professionals, advisory, charities and parents who provided really, really important ongoing guidance and support for us throughout the whole project. We had some amazing parent and advisors and children and young people who consulted to help us design the best study that we could, and also to help guide us as we were running the study. And also Dr. Seamus Byrne for his help in helping us really determine the policy priorities, which we'll talk about right at the end of the presentation. So we just wanted to say thank you to all those amazing people first. Study overview. This was a rapid cross-sectional mixed method study to scope, understand and co-develop the policy priorities for reducing inequalities and mitigating the long-term impacts of COVID-19 for children and young people with SEND. When we were applying for the funding and starting to design the study, there was lots of research that was taking place with children and young people, and also lots with adults and different groups within society, but very little focusing on this particular group of children and young people that we knew was really, really important and that were likely to have been impacted particularly by COVID and the associated lockdowns. This was a rapid cross-sectional study, so it took place over 7 months. I don't think any of us have ever worked quite so hard on a project that was really dear to our heart. So many of the methods and the processes that were described were defined by that need for rapid evidence to inform policymakers as we were moving through the pandemic. There were 3 different phases of the studies that I'll provide a little bit more detail of in a moment. The first phase was a rapid scoping review of current literature and evidence that was led by Joanna, where we were really keen to see what else was happening within the landscape of children with special educational needs and disabilities. There was quite a few charities that were conducting reports and studies just to try and gain insight into what was happening at that time. Phase 2 used structured, semi-structured online surveys with children, parents, professionals and interviews. And phase 3 were our collaborative priority setting face-to-face workshops, some of which happened online. So the first phase, and these documents on the right-hand side of your screen, there's been evidence briefings written for all sections of the project. As I say, this was a really quick project where we were really keen for the evidence to be out there as soon as possible. And so evidence briefings have been written for each part of the study that are available on the website at the end of the page, or obviously you can contact us directly. But this rapid review looked at 33 pieces of key evidence. The online surveys, we had 55 young people aged 5 to 15 years old, 893 parents, 100 educational professionals, 163 health and social care professionals, and 44 local authority staff. We feel that a real strength of the project was that multidisciplinary view on what was happening at that time, rather than just focusing on one specific group. So whilst the children and young people were really central in what we were wanting to find out, that the people responsible for their care and support around them were also really, really valuable insights. We designed the questions for the children's survey with input from children and young people with SEND, knowing that maybe ideally surveys wouldn't have been our initial choice for data collection with these young people. At the time that we collected data, we were still in lockdown and contact was reduced. But so we worked really carefully with children and young people to make sure that the questionnaires were as clear and accessible as they possibly could be for children and young people, and also for parents. The children's survey used emojis, some open text, but also children and young people told us that they quite liked really structured, short answers to be able to tell us what they thought. And we also had places to attach drawings. So it was really interesting to see your work with the COVISION project. We also provided the opportunity to attach drawings about what they felt about the pandemic and what they were living through at that time. We recruited families and parents through social media and through the close networks that we have with SEND charities and organisations. And so these surveys collected data between June and August last year. We then conducted semi-structured interviews with, again, with children and young people, parents, educational professionals, health and social care professionals, and local authority staff. With the children and young people, we used activity sheets just to try and augment that interview, knowing that some of the children and young people who we may be speaking with may struggle with online conversations with people they were less familiar with. So we made sure that each interview was individually planned for the particular young person or parent to be able to take part. And these interviews took place between August and September. Part of the surveys and part of the interviews meant that we were gathering information throughout that to not just look at experiences of the pandemic and views about good things and bad things about the pandemic, but really we wanted to be very much focused on what would help support these children and young people as we came out of the pandemic, to look at what could mitigate the impact of lockdowns and COVID on these children and young people. So part of the surveys, part of the interviews, were asking participants to tell us what are the most important things now, where should we concentrate our efforts as we move forward. And we gathered an awful lot of priorities as we were going through, which took it was a real learning process as to how to deal with that depth and breadth of information from different stakeholders, from the children, from the parents, and from those different multi-professionals. And so we used a transparent process of how we sorted through those priorities. We had hundreds of priorities from each of the groups right at the beginning. And so we had to find a way to group them together, to narrow them down so that we could take those priorities along to the workshops to help children and young people and parents, professionals work out what they should look like. And so that was quite a long process as part of the project. The priorities aligned quite simply with 5 themes that ran throughout really the whole of the study. And the priorities related to existing issues, so that one of the key findings was that many of the systems that these children with SEND are cared under didn't always work particularly well for these children. They were under great strain before COVID. And so we spent an awful long time as a team working out and trying to tease apart what were existing issues, and knowing that our funding was what is the impact of COVID and the pandemic. So whilst those existing issues were obviously really important, we had to try and tease apart what has been exacerbated by COVID, what are specific issues that the COVID pandemic has brought to these children and young people. So the resultant themes and priorities of the study were then taken to the collaborative priority setting workshops. Just going to quickly describe the workshops and then I will hand over. The workshops we knew were going to be absolutely key for working with children and young people. As I said, our first few phases had relied on remote contact, and we knew that workshops would be an opportunity for us to work creatively with children and young people. We had the opportunity to go and seek some consultation with children and young people to help us understand how we could plan those workshops best to enable that children could join in an accessible and meaningful way. The children and young people that we consulted with told us that the range of abilities of the children that we were going to talk to was going to be wide and quite individual. And so we needed to plan methods that were really, really flexible and children could engage with based on their own strengths. We knew that face-to-face working would be facilitated through giving children the opportunity to write and draw and talk, using activities that felt meaningful and familiar to them. Children told us that they didn't want to be sitting in order to participate in the methods. They wanted to be able to move and work in different ways. The children that we consulted with were very, very clear that they didn't want to listen to us talking too much. Thank you very much. They wanted to have activities that were self-explanatory, that they could be given small amounts of direction and prompts, but really that they wanted to just get stuck straight into and not have to listen to long instructions about. They wanted choice. They wanted to be able to move around at their own pace. And again, this came to this movement that felt really comfortable to a lot of children and young people. The children were really clear that they didn't want to have to be brought to an extra thing. A lot of these children felt quite anxious coming back into the world after the pandemic, and so didn't want to be brought to something which was an unfamiliar setting with unfamiliar people. They wanted us to go to them. And so that is exactly what we did. The workshops used a flexible process to how we developed the policy priorities from all the data that we had collected. We used thumbs up and thumbs down sheets where children could write or draw, or we could act as a scribe for them, which asked about their biggest challenges, what didn't work, what did work well for you during the pandemic. We took along the 5 key themes that we were developing from the data and talked about those with the young people and said, from this, what would have helped you? What would this look like for you if something was in place to make things better for you? We also took along a post box and postcards and asked children and young people and parents to write about the most important thing which needed changing, and to pretend they were writing to the Prime Minister. We wanted them to think at a big level, a national level, and we thought that having that Prime Minister figure would help them think about a bigger picture than maybe on an individual level. So we had 20 children and young people that were involved in our workshops and 11 parents and carers. The workshops with professionals took part online with a facilitated discussion again around these 5 themes, and professionals everyone had an awful lot to tell us. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll hand over.
Hi, so I'm going to talk about findings from the surveys and the interviews. Thanks, Emma. So what we found was the SEND system wasn't working prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic made everything a lot worse for children with SEND, and this exacerbated already stark inequalities. So the guidelines were there to protect adults and didn't take children with SEND into consideration. Only 6% of parents told us that their children's needs, as outlined in their EHCP, were completely met. And the professionals we spoke to told us that they wanted to see children face to face, but in many cases they were prevented from doing so. And as well as this, services had to contend with constantly changing and unclear guidelines. Some professionals told us that they were getting an email on a Sunday night and they had to adhere to the new guidelines by first thing Monday morning. Next slide, please, Emma. So this was a visual representation we created of the 5 themes, and we were aware that not all the findings were specific to COVID-19. So this visual representation just shows that the findings on the greyish post-it notes, they were pre-existing prior to COVID-19. And then the COVID magnifying glasses, they were the issues specific to the pandemic. So I'll now speak about each of these 5 areas in turn. Next slide, please, Emma. So this one is my right to play, socialise, have fun and be part of my community. I think I might need to click it again.
Oh, sorry.
Cool.
I can't go back. Oh, there we go.
My right to play, socialise, have fun and be part of my community.
So what we found was, oh, don't know if the rest, oh, there we go. So the pandemic hugely affected children with SEND's ability to attend clubs, socialise, make friends and interact with others. We found that all clubs and activities which are a lifeline for children with SEND and their parents just completely stopped and then took a long time to reopen again. We found that 71% of parents told us that their child's social skills got worse. 69% of parents told us that their child's friendships got worse. And 86% of parents told us that their child had less opportunities to play. And quite a large number of parents told us that their children already struggled making friends, but since the pandemic, many of those children have lost their friendships altogether. And it was especially hard for children who need physical activity to help them self-regulate. One parent told us that her house was like Fort Knox, just so that her children could run and swing and climb and play safely, when usually they'd be able to expend their energy going to activities and clubs like swimming and football. Some parents told us that their child's speech and language massively improved over the pandemic as they had more one-on-one time with their parents. However, there was many parents who told us that their child's speech and language got much worse. And one parent told us that their children went back to using baby speak. Next slide, please, Emma.
My right to flexibility, choice and support so I can feel safe, belong and learn in school.
Thank you. So we found that 69% of parents told us that their children's education and learning was negatively impacted over the pandemic, and 89% of parents told us that their child did not go to school during the first lockdown. This was against the backdrop that all children with an EHCP should have been able to carry on attending school, but quite a large number of parents told us that even though their child had an EHCP, they were told that their child couldn't go to school. And some parents told us that even though they were key workers and that their child had an EHCP, that their children still were not offered a place in school. Online learning worked well for some children, especially some children with autism, as there was less noise and less distractions and less need for social interaction. However, for the vast majority of children with SEND, online learning was not an adequate substitute. And many parents tried online learning with their child, but just found that it was completely impossible. Many schools experienced staff shortages, and teachers were having to do dual teaching. So this meant teaching online as well as teaching those in school. And teachers also had to spend a lot more time giving pastoral care as well. Teachers told us that they weren't able to provide differentiated work, and 58% of teachers told us that children with SEND had been more negatively impacted by the pandemic than children without SEND. 47% of parents told us that before the pandemic, their child was receiving learning support in school, but during the pandemic, this dropped to just 4%. And 62% of educational professionals told us that they had seen an increase in demand for SEND support and assessments. Next slide, please, Lucy.
My right to support for my social, emotional well-being and mental health.
So we found that children with SEND's mental health was hard hit by the pandemic. 65% of parents told us that their child's mental health had got worse. A number of parents told us about their child ending up in A&E, and many parents told us that their child was struggling to leave the house. Parents told us that there was little or no support for their child's mental health until they reached crisis point. And many parents told us how they had been referred for help numerous times, but had still not received any support up until their child did end up in A&E. We've also heard how waiting lists for mental health support were already long, but have now got even longer due to delays during the pandemic and increased demand. 58% of teachers noticed that they had seen a rise in children needing support with their mental health. And we found that autistic children in particular struggled with their mental health due to a change in routine and anxiety surrounding the pandemic. Next slide, please, Emma.
My right to health and social care services and therapies in order for me to stay healthy.
So we found that in the majority of cases, most services completely stopped over the pandemic. For example, 41% of parents told us that their child was accessing face-to-face speech and language therapy pre-pandemic, but during the first lockdown, only 1% were still accessing face-to-face speech and language. And 35% of parents told us that their child was accessing occupational therapy before the pandemic, whereas during the first lockdown, only 2% of these children were still accessing occupational therapy. And these numbers were also pretty similar for physiotherapy, respite and support groups. We found that most professionals told us that the quality of their service got worse and demand for services increased. And 47% of professionals told us that they had seen an increase in their waiting lists. Professionals told us that they'd been working harder than ever during the pandemic to try and help support families, but the services just don't have enough capacity to meet the demand. And that have seen far more burnout among staff in the workplace. One professional told us that they started out at the beginning of the pandemic as if it was a sprint, but actually it turns out to be a marathon. And many professionals have now left their roles as working every hour just wasn't sustainable. And professionals also saw a rise in safeguarding concerns and found it really difficult during the pandemic, just not being able to see children face to face to check that they were okay. And at the time of the surveys, much health and social care provision for children with SEND had still not returned.
My right to support for my parents, carers and my family.
So parents told us that there was literally no support available over the lockdowns. Families were just left to get on with it without any respite and without the usual respite from their child going to school. Professionals told us that they spent a lot of time over the lockdowns speaking on the phone to families in crisis. And one professional told us that they'd been speaking to one family who were on the verge of dropping their child off at social services just because they felt like they couldn't cope any longer. 67% of parents told us that their own mental health had got worse. And during the interviews, numerous parents spoke about having a breakdown during the pandemic and having to have a break from work just because they felt like they couldn't cope. So yeah, I think that's the findings. And I think Emma's going to talk about priorities for policy and practice.
Thank you. Can I skip to the next slide, please? Oh, thank you. I forgot about this one. So when we took all the findings, and as Lucy was saying, we took out the priorities that parents, professionals and children had highlighted that were important in terms of policy and funding to support children with SEND moving forwards. We sort of synthesised all them, tried to organise them into kind of coherent themes and priorities, and then we took those to the workshops with children and young people and asked them really what that might look like in them for practice. So we've been told that maybe they need more support with their mental health, or they need more social skill, more chance to develop social skills, but what would that actually look like? How would we go about doing that for them? So we've just got some examples here of things that they told us. So we've got some postcards that they sent to Boris Johnson, the polite ones anyway, I think, and also some of the thumbs up and thumbs down as well. So then after sort of going to these workshops with the children and the parents and the professionals, we then had the task of trying to organise these into something that would fit onto at least a couple of sides of A4, as opposed to the sort of 30-something sides we had originally. So when we were framing the priorities, just a couple of things to note about all of them really is that we framed them with a child-centred rights-based approach. So we felt it was really important to recognise that a lot of these priorities were just about meeting the rights of children. So we framed them all in that way. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And also to note as well that of the legal context in terms of the framing of the priorities. So just to recognise that when the Coronavirus Act first came in 2020, one of the first legislative changes that they enacted was to reduce local authorities' requirements to meet the needs of children with SEND from an absolute duty to a reasonable endeavours duty. So a lot of the kind of priorities that came out from our findings was centred around the fact that local authorities weren't always ensuring that children's needs as outlined in their education, health and care plans were met. Next slide, please. Thank you. And also in terms of the wider landscape to consider as well. So as we were kind of drafting the priorities, we felt that kind of, all of them could just be more funding for this, more funding for that. And to sort of avoid that repetition, we just sort of encompass them all with a recognition that services for children with SEND are already underfunded and already ill-equipped to support children. And we also wanted to acknowledge that there were many examples of professionals who worked above and beyond during the pandemic as well. So just to recognise their contribution to that. And in our final evidence briefing, we have given some examples of ways in which professionals kind of enacted and demonstrated these priorities in practice. So in order for the priorities that we present to be enacted, there's certain things that are needed for all of them. So first of all, proper implementation of the SEND legal framework, but also accountability, clear lines of responsibility. So who is responsible for delivering certain services and supporting children and families. Removal of the postcode lottery of service provision. So we know that where children live very much determines kind of the services and support that they're offered, how far they have to travel, and all that kind of thing. And that also the enactment of the priorities requires meaningful inclusion of children with SEND and their parents and carers as well. Next slide, thank you. So we've framed the priorities under the 5 themes, and we also ended up with priorities for pandemic management. So if there were another lockdown, heaven forbid, if there was another pandemic, what would need to be different next time around? But also the funding from the NIHR was about recovery and renewal. So moving out of the pandemic, recognising the things that have already happened and we can't change those, what needs to be done in the future to support the children to recover from any impacts. So talk about each one in turn. I'll try and whiz through them fairly quickly because there are quite a lot. So in terms of being able to play, socialise, have fun and be part of the community, if there were another pandemic, another lockdown, there was general kind of consensus that children with SEND needed to maintain opportunities for play and physical activity, particularly for children with things like ADHD. Movement is very important to them and is part of their condition, and so that needs to be recognised. And also potentially introducing some kind of opportunity for children with SEND to continue to be able to play either in closed pairs or social bubbles, recognising the heightened importance of being able to maintain and develop social skills as well. And also the idea of developing independence and life skills, and making sure that this is ongoing. So for a lot of older children, they may be kind of learning about using public transport, about using money, and all those things that they would normally learn in school, they lost during that time. So trying to ensure that that carries on in the event of another lockdown. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of recovery and renewal then, there was consensus among the children and parents that play and recreation activities in groups needed to be more accessible, more adaptable and more available. So they should be regular and ongoing. So quite often they were saying they kind of got given, sort of 6-session block, and they just got used to it. They just got to know people, and then it was stopped. Or also that they were driving a very long way to get there. And there was also hopes for having SEND specific groups. So there was discussion, particularly amongst the parents, of how nice it was to be amongst other parents who understood what they were going through. But also that they wanted their child to be included in typically mainstream activities as well. And so those activities should have an inclusive component. One thing that comes up in quite a few of our priorities is this idea of the staff who facilitate the sessions having SEND specific training as well. So being able to understand the needs and adjustments of children with SEND and how they need to be met. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of social, emotional well-being and mental health, if there were another lockdown, there was discussion from parents and professionals that they would like to be talking to parents and children regularly if they were at home. So a minimum of once a week to be able to offer support or signpost, just check how they're doing, see if they're okay, see if they need any additional support. They wanted tailored information and public health interventions to provide information to children with SEND, so about what's happening, about what the pandemic involves. So for instance, social stories to explain some of the COVID restrictions that have come into place. They wanted the option for mental health services to continue face-to-face or online, so whatever they preferred. Most young people found it very difficult to engage online, but a small proportion preferred that, and so being able to offer that option was good. And also the idea of ensuring that mental health services continue at a bare minimum, or even better if they're increased during another lockdown. Next slide, please. Thank you. Moving forward, there were hopes for a universal mental health prevention and promotion programme that is appropriate for children with SEND, so they can learn kind of healthy coping strategies they can put in place to prevent the onset of mental health difficulties. Again, this idea of training, so all GP services, primary care services, CAMHS professionals, having a SEND-specific component to their training so that they are all aware of the different or alternative needs of children with SEND, and also the potential to offer SEND-appropriate therapeutic alternative options as well. So for instance, talking therapy always isn't appropriate, and so things like music therapy, if that could be offered, would be beneficial. Next slide, please. In terms of education then, and looking at another pandemic, there was a desire to be offered the opportunity to attend in-person education. So while children with SEND should have been offered a place in schools during lockdown, they often weren't, or the schools said that they couldn't meet their needs. So there should always have been that option, as a lot of children found learning online extremely difficult, or the sort of systems and methods that were used just weren't appropriate. And that their lessons weren't appropriately differentiated if they were online as well. So there's also a focus on ensuring that differentiation of the curriculum continues to occur if children are learning online. A key thing that kind of underpinned a lot of this was the idea that needing clear and timely guidance from the government for schools and local authorities so that they can plan this effectively. A lot of the time, it wasn't necessarily that the schools didn't want to or weren't trying, it was just they didn't have the time, resources, training or understanding to be able to do this, to be able to do it all. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of recovery and renewal, so moving forward, there was a big push on continuing the option of a flexible curriculum, so being able to learn online or at school or a mix of both, based on what works for the needs of the child, and being able to have flexible delivery of teaching as well. So there were some teachers in our surveys who talked about, for the children with SEND who did go to school during lockdown, how much more beneficial they found it. They really, really benefited from the small class sizes, being able to go outside and do their learning outside, being able to learn in a way that kind of focused on their interests and helped them to engage. And so that kind of flexibility in the delivery of the curriculum as well was also really welcomed. Another thing that came out of the pandemic as a benefit was the increased links between mainstream and special school staff. So the mainstream school teachers quite often got support from the special schools in terms of the software that they were using, and they felt that they really benefited from that, and they learned a lot from having that support from the special schools, and so having some kind of buddy system in place. Similarly, again, having SEND-specific training in PGCEs or schools direct or whatever it is that they're doing, and also post-qualification as well for teachers who are already qualified. And the only other thing that was sort of key on there was this avoidance of pressure on academic catch-up, particularly for children with SEND. It's about them being able to reach their own potential, but not necessarily being able to reach the milestones that are set out in government guidance. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of access to health and social care therapies, the main issue was that everything just stopped during lockdown. So in the event of another lockdown, really just wanted uninterrupted, regular, ongoing access to therapies that could be online or face-to-face based on the needs of the child and their parents. If things were at home or online, they wanted parents to be provided with the equipment that is normally used so that they can continue the therapies at home. And there was concern around safeguarding issues as well, that a lot of professionals felt that they really were worried about children who are considered to be at risk, and because they couldn't see them, or they could only talk to them on the phone, or they could only see them kind of shoulders up online. And so they really wanted to be able to continue to see children who are considered to be at risk face to face throughout any lockdowns going into or whether that be going into the home or school. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of moving forward, there was just the general push on reducing waiting lists for both therapies and assessments. Though a lot of professionals did find the option of online meetings quite useful, so especially if the teams are multidisciplinary, they found that they got a lot more people together a lot easier online. And also sometimes the parents welcomed not having to drive however many miles to attend an appointment. So having that option of both. And again, having SEND specific training components for health and social care professionals so that they are all aware of how to meet the needs of children with SEND. Next slide, please. And then final theme was the support for parents and carers and family. So in terms of pandemic management, it was largely around children being able to go to school if that's what the parents wanted, so that they could get that bit of respite, or they can continue working as well if they need to. Similarly, continuing to offer the normal respite and short break provision that goes on as well. The other thing on there to note was that they wanted to be informed of how changes in the law or the regulations would impact the services that were delivered in accordance with their child's education, health and care plan. So what would the impact be on that? What would stop? What would change and why? Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of recovery and renewal, parents really wanted this support group to meet other parents who were sort of in a similar situation to them, who understood what their life was like and sort of the difficulties that they faced. And they also wanted to be meaningfully involved in meetings about their child as well. So they felt often that they were kind of the expert on their child, but this wasn't taken into account in whether that was EHCP meetings, medical meetings or annual reviews. And there was also maybe discussion of having some more training available for parents to help them with their SEND health literacy. So being able to understand the services that are available, the support that's available for them, and also knowing what their children's rights are as well. So what is a legal requirement for their child to be able to access, and what services should legally be doing for their child. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. That's all from us. Feel free to ask us any questions.
Thank you very much, Emma, Lucy, Joanna. It was a wonderful presentation. So I'm wondering, we don't have many people, so I'm going to ask anybody from the team, from the attendees, would like to come along and ask any questions. Harry, I know you are big into children's rights. I know the focus of the project, I know children with the special needs, but also around the children's right activity. So I'm going to ask yourself, Harry, to come in here for a minute, and then if you want to ask any questions around or any clarification with the team would be great. Thank you.
Or can't hear you, Harry.
Oh. Carmel Corrigan is here from Ombudsman for Children's Office. Carmel, your hands are up. Can you, yeah, you can come along and ask the question as well, Carmel.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, hang on a minute.
Sorry,
right.
Harry.
Okay, you hearing me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I can also see Carmel Corrigan. Dr. Carmel Corrigan is here from the Ombudsman Children's Office, and Carmel hands are up. So I may, sorry, Harry, I know you are.
Okay, Carmel, go first.
Yeah, is that okay? Thank you, Harry. Carmel, yeah.
Thank you, Harry. Suja, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, can I just say my hands are always up because I just admit to everything, so that's fine. I just would like to ask a couple of questions really, because we in the office have very recently, as in the last couple of weeks, put together a kind of an advisory panel of children with a very wide range of SEND. Like it's very wide, it's very broad. And I'm just wondering, in terms of running your workshops and your communications with the children prior to those workshops, etc., about how you used the activities to ensure that children, as I said, with very, very different levels of ability, could actually participate on some kind of equal basis. It's not something we have much experience of. So at a practical level, it would be really, really good to know, to know a little bit more about that.
It's a really good question. Emma, shall I take that one? Is that okay? So Carmel, yeah, it is a really good question. And I think to approach it with an open mind, to go with a plan, but know that you will have to be really flexible and to have time. I think to give children, young people space and time, I think felt really important. And to not have assumptions. So I think to not have assumptions about how children, young people will want to share their views and their abilities to share their views. So I think we were really surprised in the quality and quantity of information that the children, young people shared in the workshops. And I know we had some doubters about how well they would go. And actually the children, young people were amazing, and shared some really insightful information. Didn't always use the methods exactly as we had intended. I think we acted as a scribe sometimes to write down things that they were telling us. They chose not to always want to write down. So we were very flexible, but always approached it from an opinion that the children were able to contribute, if we provided that environment to be able to contribute. So it was, really, really, really interesting. And the methods did work really well. I know one of the head teachers, because we went into a couple of special schools, the head teacher said that a couple of the children had been really nervous about coming in and meeting people that they didn't know at all. But we had stuff everywhere. We had papers on the floor, we had post-it note colors, and they just got stuck in. It felt welcoming. It didn't feel it didn't feel scary or intimidating, because we sat on the floor with the children and the young people. So I think we just allowed space and time and went with the direction that the children and young people wanted to go in. Don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does very much, and it's very helpful, and I suppose it's reflective in a way of what the approach that we're trying to take. I think the difficulty for us, and I don't know whether you have any insight or advice on this at all, and you may not have, is that unfortunately this is being done remotely, because of some of the disabilities in particular. It would be extremely difficult for them to come together. So it's being done on Zoom. So that kind of adds a layer that, we can't physically do all of the things that we would normally do if we were together. We can't physically sit down beside a child. We can't physically get on the floor with them. So we're I suppose we're struggling a little bit, but I suppose is that the remote adds an extra layer to it. Just wondering, have you any experience, any advice?
Yeah, so I think remote consultation with some of these children, young people can be more challenging. Also can mean that children, young people feel a little bit more comfortable because they haven't had to travel out with their home, where they actually feel quite empowered. I know some children, young people that we've worked with quite like the chat, so don't necessarily want to share their views verbally, but will quite happily type in chat. So there are advantages from that remote kind of contact, but I would still have a few methods kind of planned, some choices, and to try and make it as interactive as possible, but to give them a choice as to how they can share their views, not just to share verbally, because we know that can be problematic for some children and young people.
Yeah, and this is very problematic for some of these. But and also just very last question. Sorry, Joanna, I can see Joanna has her hand up. Sorry, just one very last question is, what size were the working groups?
The workshop, so there were about 10 children, young people, 8 to 10 children, young people at the different workshops. The consultation group that we met with that helped us plan them, there was 5 children and young people. So it varied.
Oh, that's great, thank you.
Also, just to flag, there were 10, but there were 3 or 4 of us plus a teacher quite often. So it was kind of 1 to 3 probably.
Yeah. Okay,
that's a good point. Joanna?
Thank you. Joanna, you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add to what Lucy said, really, just in regards to the interviews. So we had a quick 10-minute hello interview before the actual interview, which I think was really helpful as well. So we kind of get to know the child and speak with them first, or communicate with them first. And I think this gave us a better idea of like their kind of preferred communication styles and abilities. And there was one child who communicates by typing. So his mum was like, I think if you just send the questions over and then he can type his replies, he'd prefer that rather than having to keep typing. He can do it at his own pace. So that was what we did. And then there was another child as well who was telling me how much his trampoline helped him during lockdown. So then he proceeded to like take me to his trampoline and started bouncing on his trampoline. And then that was the end of the interview then. But it was just that flexibility and that understanding that it might look a bit different. Like,
and I think, you know, we would have spoken with all of the children on this panel before we ever brought them together and spoken with parents and everything. But I think that's a key thing actually that we learned from those conversations is everything has to go out in advance, you know, and well in advance, so that they have an opportunity to prepare how they want to respond to you. And I think that's absolutely critical in this kind of work. Thank you so much. Sorry, Harry.
Thank you, Kamal.
No problem.
Harvey, before I know I'm going to hand over to you now.
No, it's okay.
We are in the similar situation at the moment because we are collecting data. Then we will have a participatory workshop across the globe. Again, our workshop will be children aged 10 to 17, a creative workshop. Again, we will be using the online platform. So we are going to face more challenges. We already faced numerous challenges with a crack across the globe. Even with our own crack was a lot of challenges, because as Lucy mentioned, you know, is it good for children to see face to face, work with them, sit down with them. With the COVID, this has imposed so many challenges for us as researchers as well. You know, to build the rapport and then these online activities, then the language. So what we did, we have a partners across the globe. So we are working with the partner. So they already have access to the crack members. For example, we have a crack in India. So I do go with the Indian crack with the other members in Australia to make sure that they have an understanding, because they don't really understand Irish accent or English accent. You know, you have to be somebody like my accent, either an Indian or you know, just to make sure how we bring the global perspective into this data collection as well. So Harry, I may go to yourself now. Is that okay?
Well, we actually have some questions, one in the chat and one in the Q&A. So if I can do those. There's one from Fiona who I can't see on my screen. So maybe maybe she's gone. I'll read this question out and then whoever on the team. So this is from Fiona Cooper. Cooper something to everyone. The question is, what can be done to ensure children are listened to and consulted during anything like the pandemic in the future? I was struck by your comment about how a lot of the changes were to protect adults.
Yeah, do you want me to start, Emma? So I think there's lots of evidence to show that in the pandemic, children were not always prioritized. I think children's views and them being involved in consultations about decisions didn't happen as well as it could. I think we could learn a lot from that. Hopefully we never will, but if another pandemic comes, hopefully there's been a lot of evidence to show that we could have done much better about that, and that we excluded children at many levels in making decisions about pandemic management. And so I would hope that some of the work that's happened this time will show how important it is next time to work with children and young people to make sure that they are involved.
Okay. Now, if
couple of questions in the chat function, which is
yes.
the Q&A function. So we have a Desmond. I know Desmond, you are here anyway. Would you like to maybe ask directly to Lucy?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was just thinking that the closure and restrictions in services was quite widespread. So there's a kind of similar effect in a lot of places, and it might be different based on the level of disability of the child, etc. But were there differences in the experiences of children who kind of contracted COVID themselves, potentially because of group settings, or whose family, had a burden of disease in the family and stuff like that? Well, I wasn't sure if you covered it in the presentation, sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We didn't actually collect information about whether people had had COVID in our data collection, I think because some of the children shared stories of their mum having had it, or some of the parents might have told us that they had experiences of that, but at no point did it feel like that was important in this massive problem within the SEND system. So no, we didn't collect information like that. So we wouldn't be able to answer your question specifically, sorry.
No problem, thanks very much. Just I've been dealing with, so I do some teaching at third level, and a lot of the students that I work with, they are carers themselves, or they're high functioning adults. So they have jobs, they have kids, they have parents they work with. Just what I've seen from them is that even though a lot of restrictions are gone, like the after effects of the pandemic are still there. Like the needs and stuff among fully able people are considerably higher this year than even during the pandemic. People aren't able to meet kind of requirements to have for courses. They're more stressed out, all that kind of stuff. Do you, like, if you're continuing this research on, do you have kind of a longitudinal component here to track some of those effects for children with disabilities as well?
Yeah, we don't, unfortunately. We haven't, there isn't a longitudinal element to the project because the evidence was needed kind of as quickly as possible. But it's a really good question, and actually we were still collecting data kind of after lockdown had come out, and many of the children, young people and professionals and parents were identifying that it had been really hard for these children, young people who were expected to one day be at home and then the next day be back in a fully functioning school. And that change was massive for a lot of children, young people, specifically those with autism, with high levels of anxiety, and there weren't, across the board, that transition didn't always happen particularly well. There was an expectation that these children, young people would just be able to get on with it. And I think there have been reported higher rates of, kind of not wanting to go to school and anxiety around school attendance since that lockdown, and having to return back to normal life, or new normal.
I know, thanks Desmond. When we are collecting some of the data with my colleagues here, Sherry from Canada, so we looked into children and young people with complex care needs, and it's very much like a cocooning. So they really want to, especially parents, they really want to cocoon. They're afraid to contract with COVID and the impact. So that's always coming like a protective factor. So did you come across anything like that as part of your study, because you are looking at the special education needs?
Emma, I'm aware I'm talking. Do you want to take that?
Yes, I was just trying to unmute myself. Yes, I think there was a lot of worries, I think, from parents, and Joanna might be able to talk more to that in the interviews, but general kind of, a lot of fear about letting their child go to school or letting other people come into their house to care for them. So there was always that kind of balance of really needing the respite and really finding it too much, but also so much fear about what happens to your child when they go to school and interact with other people. So yes, I think there was quite a lot of that going on. Joanna, I don't know if there's anything that came up for you in the interviews with that.
Yeah, there was quite a bit in the interviews, and especially as well in the responses, the open text responses from the local authority professionals as well, and some of the other professionals. I think they've said some of the biggest obstacles was actually like the parents' worries and the parents' anxieties of letting their children go back to school. And I know in the surveys as well, a lot of parents said as well their children are struggling to leave the house, and they just didn't want to go out and didn't want to go back to school at all.
We are nearly there. We have 1 minute to finish. So finally, Harry, do you want to ask anything?
Well, I was going to say that I was thinking of the Laura Lundy model, which you'll be familiar with, the model of children's participation. They need a space, they need a voice, they need an audience, and they need to have influence. And I heard you describe brilliantly the marvelous creation of a space. I mean, really, this was about how do we create a space for these children to express their views, and in that space the children had a voice. And again, you talked brilliantly about how you enabled that voice to be expressed and heard, and you guys were the first audience, obviously. but you're not the audience who have influence. Like you obviously heard because you presented how you'd actually refined what you learned from the children to a whole series of policy recommendations. But the audience that needs to hear are the policymakers, because they are the ones who will have influence. So what can you guys, now that you've got this marvelous presentation of recommendations based on the children's voices, what's the next step to make sure that this has influence with the people who are going to change things? That was going to be my question, so there it is.
I'll very quickly, that is, yeah, something that is causing us some sleepless nights, I think. That we really do want to make sure that these voices get into, particularly the SEN reviews coming up. So we have actually just been awarded some extra funding for policy support, so to make sure that it gets into policy as much as possible. So we presented it to the Department for Education a couple of weeks ago. We've submitted it to the SEN review. We had the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for SEN attend one of our webinars. So we are trying. We're very hopeful that it will. Lucy, sorry, did you want to?
No, apologies. I need to leave. I'm being called into another meeting. I do apologize. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. And it was wonderful to have you today and listening to the presentation. And I think the next funding is really going to benefit, to bring the children's voice and children's right to the policy level, and so that you can make some changes. I really wanted to thank you on the behalf of the COVISION team, and our funder is HRB Health Research Board Ireland, for coming in today and discussing your project and the findings. And everybody is learning from each other. It's a fantastic platform to learn from each other. And thank you so much taking time to join us today. And have a good day ahead, and take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.